Alrighty, welcome everybody. I'll just give everyone another minute to jump in and then we'll get started. Alrighty. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Insight PBS's Positive Pathways webinar series. I'm Jess Kaufman-Wood, Clinical Manager at Insight PBS, and I'm just so delighted to have you all join us today for our second webinar of the series. This series is dedicated to laying out the foundation of understanding and implementing positive behaviour support, and our goal really is to introduce you to core concepts and practical strategies that will help empower professionals, families, and community members alike so that we can drive some positive change for the people we all support. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. So today we're joined by Ainsley, who is one of our incredible proficient practitioners here at Insight PBS. She'll be presenting an introduction to restrictive practices, a very big topic in behaviour support, of course. And so the way we'll proceed today is Ainsley will deliver the main presentation, which will last approximately 40 to 45 minutes. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time using the chat function. I'll be monitoring the chat and may address some of your questions during the presentation as well. We'll also have a dedicated 10 to 15 minute Q&A session at the end where we can discuss any key questions that have come through the chat. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and a replay will be sent to all registered attendees within 24 hours. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ainsley to begin today's presentation on an introduction to restrictive practices.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for having me today. So as Jess said, my name is Ainsley. I'm a proficient behaviour support practitioner with Insight PBS, and I will be discussing restrictive practices with you today. So having a little look at today's agenda, we'll be talking through the key principles and practices of PBS and how it can empower individuals and improve quality of life. We'll start by covering what PBS is, have a little bit of a rundown, look at the risks of harm behaviours and the role of restrictive practices. We'll then discuss the professional obligations of behaviour support practitioners, NDIS providers, and the importance of parent and caregiver involvement. And finally, we'll explore the PBS process, the benefits of a collaborative approach, and some real-world examples. So by the end, you'll have a really solid understanding of how PBS can make meaningful difference if done well and collaboratively with all stakeholders. So we'll have a look at questions at the end as well. If there's anything that we've missed or anything that you feel is a real burning question, we can address that at the end. All right, so let's jump in. So a little bit about me just to start off. As I said, I'm a proficient behaviour support practitioner with Insight PBS. I've had a very coloured work history. I've always worked with people. I used to be a flight attendant when I was doing my undergraduate degree in psychology. I've supported people through crisis at Lifeline, and now I work with Insight PBS, and I have been for the past 2.5, verging on 3 years, while also completing my postgraduate honours in psychology. So working with people is a big passion of mine, and understanding and educating as well. So I'm really happy to be doing this. In my current role, I provide a high level of support for those with behaviours of concern, their families, their carers, and the stakeholders involved in support. So just jumping into an overview of positive behaviour support. So PBS, Positive Behaviour Support, is a person-centred, evidence-based approach that improves quality of life and reduces behaviour of concern. It focuses on understanding behaviour, where we identify the reasons behind behaviours and address any underlying needs. We create supportive environments, so modifying surroundings to promote positive behaviours and to reduce any triggers. We reduce restrictive practices, prioritizing dignity, choice, and rights by using proactive, positive strategies. Upskilling support networks, so training families, support workers, and professionals to implement effective strategies, making sure that we're constantly educating, constantly having open discussions, just making sure that everyone's working as a team, everyone's on the same page, bleeding into a collaborative approach. So behaviour support practitioners act as intervention coaches, guiding teams in delivering consistent person-centred support. So ongoing assessment and improvement is so important as well. We're constantly using data and monitoring to refine strategies and making sure that we're ensuring sustainable change. So we want to stay on top of strategies. We want to see what's working and what's not working. And that all just works in together with communication. So moving on to the key principles of PBS, we are guided by some core principles. Individualized, that's every behaviour support plan is tailored to a person's unique needs, strengths, and preferences to ensure effectiveness. Strength-based, so PBS focuses on what a person can do rather than their limitations, which helps foster confidence and independence. Collaborative, the PBS process involves family, carers, support workers, and professionals, ensuring shared decision-making, and we're all working towards the same goal. Like I said before, communication, open communication is also important in understanding that every environment is working together, and also data-driven. So PBS really relies heavily on behaviour tracking and data analysis to continuously refine and improve strategies. Okay, so understanding the risk of harm behaviour. So risk of harm refers to behaviours that have the potential to cause physical, emotional, or psychological harm to the person or those around them. These behaviours are often called behaviours of concern because they signal an unmet need rather than being a problem to simply fix or control. So some common examples of risk of harm behaviours include self-injuries such as headbanging, biting, or scratching themselves, aggression towards others, so hitting, kicking, pushing, or making verbal threats, property destruction, breaking objects, throwing items, or damaging their environment, unsafe actions such as running away, wandering, engaging in risky behaviours, or putting oneself in dangerous situations, such as, not being aware of their surroundings when crossing the street. So it's really important to recognise that these behaviours are not random. It's something we really, really try and push in PBS. They often serve as a communication function, expressing frustration, discomfort, fear, or an unmet need when the person may not have another way to communicate effectively. And that's when we start to look into those functions of behaviour and break those down. So understanding the contributing factors and the underlying cause is key. These behaviours may be influenced by communication difficulties. So if a participant struggles to express themselves, they might resort to their behaviour as a form of communication. Sensory needs. So some individuals may engage in behaviours to seek or avoid certain sensory experiences. Environmental stresses, so changes in routine, overwhelming environments, or lack of structure can increase distress. Underlying health conditions, pain, fatigue, or untreated medical issues can significantly impact behaviour. So rather than simply managing symptoms, we need to look deeper and understand what's driving this behaviour. So these come into all of our different approaches. So we have a support approach where our goal is to ensure safety while maintaining dignity and respect. So this basically means we're conducting thorough assessments, we're understanding triggers and identifying strengths and needs, we're using proactive strategies, creating environments that support behaviour, support positive behaviour, rather than waiting to react when things escalate. So really trying to look ahead, always trying to be one step ahead. That comes all the way back to communication. We need to be talking about what's going on at home, what's going on at school or in a SIL or at a day program, and just making sure that we're all working together, because if we're just reacting, then it's going to be really hard to get on top of. Empowering support networks, so making sure that families, carers and professionals have the skills and knowledge to provide the right support. So making sure that we're educating, we're understanding other people's knowledge. It's very often that everyone working in the space is quite knowledgeable. And so just having those open discussions is really key. And prioritizing those person-centered interventions. So focusing on what works best for the individual rather than relying on restrictive or reactive approaches. So by addressing the root cause of the risk of harm behaviours and providing comprehensive support, we can create meaningful, lasting change that improves a person's quality of life, their independence, and it also keeps everyone safe. So let's jump into understanding restrictive practices. So the reason why we're all here. So as positive behaviour support practitioners, one of our key responsibilities is identifying and working to reduce the use of restrictive practices and, where possible, eliminating them altogether. So restrictive practices are any interventions that limit a person's rights, freedoms, decision-making, or movement in any way. And they should only ever be used as a last resort when there is an immediate risk of harm. So it's important to recognise that some restrictive practices are necessary to ensure the safety of the individual and those supporting them. So the types of restrictive practices. We're going to go through the main types of RPs that we look out for and that we provide support with. So when you're ready, Jess, just the next slide.
Is that correct?
All right, beautiful. Yeah,
yep.
That's perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we have seclusion. So seclusion is when a person is placed in a room or a space where they're alone and they're unable to leave or feel like they cannot leave. So this might include locking doors, blocking exits, or isolating a person in a way that restricts their freedom. So seclusion is particularly concerning as it can increase distress, escalate behaviours, and negatively impact mental health. Instead of seclusion, we focus on environmental adjustments, de-escalation techniques, and proactive strategies to support the person safely without removing them from social settings. So an example of a seclusion restrictive practice might be if, a parent or a caregiver locks their child in a room at night because they come out during the night and they sort of cause terror, they pull at things, they might pull paintings off the wall and pull things out of the fridge in the pantry while the parent's asleep. So they lock the door from the outside to keep them asleep, and keep them in their room and to keep them secluded. And, from the outset, sometimes, it sounds quite full on, and it does happen. It's so dangerous if there's a fire, if there's something where you need to get out really quickly. It could be, life or death. It's really, really important to be aware of these things. Moving into chemical restraints. So this refers to using medication to influence or control behaviour rather than to treat a medical condition. This could include medications that sedate or suppress a person's ability to respond to their environment. So while medication may be appropriate for medical needs, it should not be used as a substitute for proper behavioural support. So our role is to ensure that behaviour is understood and supported in ways that do not rely on unnecessary medication, and that there's a clear plan for reducing reliance on chemical restraints where possible. So when we look at chemical restraints, they are one of our main restrictive practices that we do see. As we have a lot of participants that might have certain diagnoses that require certain chemical restraints, ones that we see a lot, we've got Ritalin, Risperidone. It's really important to understand if this is being administered for behaviours, and that's when we go and we speak to the GPs and we speak to the parents and the implementing providers to really understand the root of why this is happening. And when, we look at reducing reliance of chemical restraints, it's not to say that we want to completely cut it out. It might even be just limiting the dosage or reducing the dosage a little bit. So we don't want to look at it as we completely want to fix this sort of restrictive practice and we want to cut it out completely. It might even just be that slight reduction. So that's important to keep in mind as well. So moving on to physical restraints, it's when a person's movement is restricted by another person. So this could include holding someone's arms down, restraining them in a chair, or using physical force to prevent movement. Physical restraints carry serious risks, including injury, trauma, and loss of trust. Instead, we focus on preventative strategies, de-escalation, and teaching alternative communication and coping skills to reduce situations where physical restraints might be considered. So we'll talk about this a little bit further on. Physical restraints can be quite difficult, especially if you are sort of dealing with a parent or a caregiver It happens every single day, even with children that don't have behaviors of concern. If they're getting a needle and they have to be held down, or, if they're kind of having a little bit of even a panic attack or something and they need to be held down by their parents, it's important to remember that if this is happening with a parent, this can't be happening with an implementing provider just sort of as a given. We'll talk a little bit more about those difficult conversations and how things need to be communicated. But it is important to remember, just keeping that in mind, that these things might be really common if you're working with families, but just having that sort of little light switch in your head to think, is this a physical restraint, or is this just something that's happened since birth? So moving on to mechanical. A mechanical restraint refers to using a device or equipment to restrict movement. So this might include straps, belts, splints, or restrictive clothing designed to prevent a person from moving freely. So while some mechanical devices may be needed for medical or safety reasons, such as seatbelts in wheelchairs, it becomes a restrictive practice when used solely to control the behaviour. So as PBS practitioners, we work to ensure that any mechanical restraints used are justified, monitored, and a part of a clear plan to reduce that reliance on them. So our last RP is our environmental restraint. So environmental restraint refers to restricting access to items or areas due to behaviours. So this might be the kitchen. If your participant has a binge eating behaviour or food stealing behaviour, locking the kitchen up, or having, a half door, or locking cupboards if someone has a habit of accessing items that may cause them harm. So while we aim to minimise and eliminate restrictive practices, these are some situations where they might be used as a last resort to prevent serious harm. In these cases, restrictive practices must be clearly justified, monitored, and paired with strategies to reduce reliance on them over time. So now let's have a look. We've looked at RPs. We're going to have a look at what's not an RP, so an unregulated practice. So it's important to remember as well, not all behaviour support strategies are restrictive. So some common supports are unregulated under the NDIS. These can be visual prompts and reminders, proximity or presence for reassurance, so just standing around, standing close by, just making sure you're there, offering choices or structured routines. So there's a really big difference between offering choices in activity or how the day-to-day runs, working with a participant to move through their day, rather than saying, this is what we're going to do. You're going to stay in your room until this time, then you're going to come out at this time. And we're going to, telling them what to do, structuring it that way. So really involving them is one way to reduce it so it's not an RP. Intent and impact really matter. So that's sort of, I guess, the flow and effect of that. Strategies must be used respectfully and consistently. And when in doubt, consulting with the behaviour support practitioner, consulting with your manager, having open discussions, having those care team meetings with all stakeholders. So it's important to really acknowledge as well that while RPs are sometimes necessary to maintain safety, they should always be implemented with caution and care. So our role is not to police or inform these practices, but to support stakeholders in understanding them and ensuring they're used ethically, and then working collaboratively on a fade-out plan. So we're always aiming for the least restrictive option possible, and we can't recommend restrictive practices without first considering all other alternatives. So there'll be times when difficult conversations are needed to have. So not all stakeholders or carers will feel comfortable including restrictive practices or may not see their use as necessary. It's our responsibility in those situations to approach with empathy, transparency, and a commitment to education, while ensuring that the person's rights and safety remain central to any decision that's made. So, as Jess has said to me, we're not the RP police. We are not coming down on people we don't want to report anyone. We don't want to be getting anyone in trouble, which I think is the sole reason that we need to educate and have these open discussions, because restrictive practice can sound like a scary word. Especially to, support workers that might be new to the industry, or parents whose children have just received a diagnosis. It can be hard to understand. You might be in situations as well where someone's implementing an RP without even realising it, and then that's quite a shock to them. Or, some people might just not want to go through the reporting, which is unfortunately, that's just what we've got to do. So having those difficult conversations is something that might happen sometimes, but it's just important to have that knowledge in the back of your head. And if you're in doubt, again, just ask your manager, reach out to other pracs and just talk about it, because there will be an answer out there somewhere. Okay, so conditions for restrictive practices moving forward. So ensuring ethical use of our RPs. So while RPs may be sometimes necessary to ensuring safety, they must always be justified and properly documented. So any restrictive practice must be included in a behaviour support plan, and where required, reported in PRODA, the NDIS system designed to track and regulate the use of restrictive practices. So we want to make sure that they are being reviewed regularly. So restrictive practices are not indefinite solutions. Plans are only valid, as we know, for a set period and must be reviewed every 6 or 12 months before expiry to determine if they're still necessary or can be reduced. So sometimes we think, we're going to look at these, our BSPs expiring. Oh, let's look at some new strategies. We need to revamp everything. We need to really hone in on RPs. That's what our data's for. That's what our monitoring's for. That's what our care team meetings are for. So we want to make sure that every time, if not, every 6 weeks, at least before when we're reviewing our BSPs, we need to be reviewing these, because there could be major changes that are happening and we need to be on top of them. So we want to make sure as well that these are used only as a last resort. So before recommending a restrictive practice, we have to ensure that all other intervention strategies have also been trialled. So understanding what has already been attempted also helps us identify new strategies to reduce or eliminate restrictive practices over time. So informed consent from the person or the guardian must always be granted before implementation. So what restrictive practices should never be used for? Punishment. They're not a consequence for a behaviour. Shouldn't be used for convenience. They can't be used to make things easier for support staff. And coercion or control. The person's rights, dignity, and autonomy always needs to be respected. And that's going to come into, again, having difficult conversations with people and just having that knowledge to back yourself up. Can be really difficult in something that is such a high, something that is of such high importance, to understand what is right and what is not right. So it might not happen very often, but there are sometimes restrictive practices that just have to be ceased immediately. And those also need to be included in your report. So having a look at regulation and ethical responsibility, the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission strictly regulates the use of restrictive practices to protect the dignity and rights of individuals. As PBS practitioners, our role is to advocate for people's rights, ensuring that any restrictive practice is necessary, justified, and used ethically. We're promoting positive alternatives, identifying and implementing strategies that reduce the need for the restrictions, and empowering support networks. So training families, educating carers and professionals in proactive approaches that create a safer, more supportive environment. And reach out to the stakeholders as well. So reach out to the psychs, the OTs, the speeches. Try and understand if they've got other strategies that might help you in your fade out plan or reducing RPs, or if they have something in their space that's come up that we're not aware of yet. So important to have that open dialogue. Our RPs should only ever be used when absolutely necessary to prevent harm. And even then, we want to reduce it to the shortest time possible. So let's look at some NDIS providers and reporting. So under the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, there are strict requirements around who must report restrictive practices and how they're reported. So these rules are in place to ensure transparency, accountability, and ethical practice when supporting NDIS participants. So who needs to report? Any NDIS registered provider that engages in a regulated restrictive practice must report it in PRODA, the NDIS reporting system. If a provider supports NDIS participants but is not registered and uses RPs, they must become registered in order to comply with NDIS requirements. So understanding reporting responsibilities, the provider, not us, not the BSP, is responsible for reporting every instance of a restrictive practice in PRODA. When a BSP is in place, the provider's reporting obligations change. So RPs can be reported once per month instead of every day. They may still need to distinguish between routine and unauthorised use of restrictive practices. Reporting is incredibly important because it ensures that restrictive practices are monitored and used ethically. It encourages providers to work towards reducing and eliminating restrictive practices over time, and it helps safeguard the dignity, rights, and safety of NDIS participants. So essentially, our goal is to avoid long-term reliance on medications, restraints, or locked environments as a solution. While these measures may sometimes be necessary in the short term for safety, they do not support the person in developing independence, autonomy, or meaningful life skills. So over time, RPs can limit opportunities for learning, reduce self-determination, and even reinforce distress or trauma. So instead, we focus on addressing the underlying cause of behaviour, building skills, and creating supportive environments that empower individuals to thrive without unnecessary restrictions. It's important as well, just to jump back into the reporting. It's oftentimes where you'll see a restrictive practice maybe is being family implemented, but they are going to a day program where they're not an implementing provider. So there might be a little bit of a push if we're seeing behaviours of concern at the day program for, the restrictive practice that is used at home to be implemented there. They can't do that. If the behaviours of concern is happening at the day program and, there's an RP being implemented at home that helps it, it's not going to be possible to be able to use that unless they become an implementing provider. So there are times as well where you'll find that there are tricky little, situations that you find yourself in, and it's important to just talk to people, explain why this can't happen, and then using those proactive strategies. So really, really understanding the behaviours and the underlying causes. So there are a lot of state and territory differences as well, which I know has been quite a hot topic. So each state and territory has its own process for approving the use of RPs in NDIS settings. Behaviour support practitioners must be familiar with their local requirements. So if we have a little look through our table here, in New South Wales, the authorisation process is the Restrictive Practices Authorisation Panels. So it's mandatory for providers and they must submit to an independent panel for approval. Then we'll have a meeting and then it will either be approved. It'll be authorised or unauthorised. So in Victoria, I'm not going to pretend as well that I know everything about all the state and territories as I am from New South Wales, but we can have a little bit more of a chat about that after. So in Victoria, it's a senior practitioner, the OSP. All restrictive practices must be approved by the OSP with strong regulatory oversight. Queensland, Positive Behaviour Support Panel, so the PBSP, operates under the Department of Seniors, Disability Services and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships. In WA, the authorisation from the Officer of the Chief Psychiatrist. So separate processes for children and adults with an emphasis on therapeutic supports. South Australia, the Senior Practitioner, oversees the restrictive practice reporting and authorisation, focusing on human rights. In Tasmania, the Senior Practitioner, similar to South Australia, requires authorisation and a strong emphasis on least restrictive practice. ACT, Senior Practitioner, centralised authorisation system for regulated restrictive practices. And the Northern Territory, so the Department of Health and Authorised Program Officer, authorisation is required through designated officers within the department. So whatever state or territory you're in, it's really important to understand all the processes. This is obviously just an overview and just a really brief little insight, but there are a lot of different rules and regulations. So yeah, it's important to discuss with people that are in your state or territory as to what the process is moving through. So let's have a look now into parents and restrictive practices. So as I said before, it does get a little bit difficult sometimes when you are working with parents and understanding restrictive practices and explaining restrictive practices. Some things might not be understood in the way that we kind of expect them to because we're working with them every day. So unlike registered NDIS providers, parents and informal carers are not required to report RPs in PROTA. However, that does not mean restrictive practices in the home go unaddressed. So why aren't they required to report? So parents and informal carers are not registered NDIS providers. The NDIS Commission regulates service providers, not family caregiving. So child protection laws govern any significantly inappropriate restrictions by parents. If restrictive practices used by a parent are inappropriate or harmful, say, like I mentioned before, seclusion for extended periods of time where the child is deprived of their basic needs, this falls under child protection laws, not NDIS regulations. However, if it was something more like holding someone's hand to stop them from self-injury or hurting others, then that is something that a practitioner could support a family with. So what happens when we become involved? So a behaviour support practitioner still works to reduce and eliminate restrictive practices in the home and family setting. So our main goal doesn't change. Any restrictive practice used by a parent is still documented in the behaviour support plan, the BSP. Like I said, that's when you need to educate. We need to have that knowledge and make sure that they understand as well why this is happening and that we're not trying to demonise them. We're just trying to help and understand. So these practices are still reviewed within the same time frame, so every 6 to 12 months. However, parents are not required to report restrictive practices in PROTA because they're not regulated under the NDIS Commission. So just to be clear, like I said before, we're not the RP police. Our goal is to support, not judge. We want to understand and we want to help individuals, families, and providers find alternatives to restrictive practices that still prioritize safety and well-being. At the end of the day, we just want to make sure that every individual has the independence, autonomy, and the choice to move forward in their life the way that's going to make them happy and the way that's going to have the best quality of life for them. Restrictive practices are not always bad. Sometimes they're just necessary for safety. Now, focus is on ensuring that they're used appropriately with a plan for reducing reliance on them where possible. At the end of the day, PBS is about support and not control. We work alongside families and carers and all the stakeholders to create safe, ethical, and person-centered solutions that promote independence and dignity. So let's move into the PBS process. So our PBS process is a structured, ongoing journey focused on understanding, supporting, and creating meaningful change. It's not a quick fix. I sometimes find that it can be, that fix-it attitude, get very caught up with that, but it's not. It's not a quick fix. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's structured. It's got to be ongoing. It's got to have a lot of different bits and pieces to fit into the puzzle to make it work. So we've got to look at assessment and understanding. We gather information about the person's strengths and needs, environments, and the behaviours of concern. So we really focus on spending that first few weeks just really understanding the person, really understanding the individual, who they are, their family, how they grew up, all of the bits and pieces that tell us who they are. Might be observations, interviews, data collection. We might go out and have a chat, talk to their supports, sort of see who the team is and get an understanding of that on a deeper level, and then start to look at the underlying causes of behaviour. Behaviours, as we mentioned before, often serve as a communication function. Our job is to understand what the person is trying to communicate, what are they trying to express, and then finding alternative ways to support them. We then develop a behaviour support plan, so our BSP. It's not just about managing behaviour. It is about creating opportunities for the individual to thrive. So the plan includes proactive strategies to reduce the behaviours of concern before they start. So we'll look at early warning signs, then we look at escalation, we look at what we can do in all of the different steps leading up to, during, and after the behaviour of concern. We look at skill building strategies to help the person develop alternative ways to meet their needs, environmental adjustments that need to be made if necessary to make sure their surroundings are supporting their positive behaviours, and clear guidelines on restrictive practices if they are being used, including a plan to minimise or eliminate them over time. So that's going to be our fade out plan. So just before I jump into the next implementation and support, a fade out plan essentially is going to be doesn't have to be super, super detailed. It can just be an overview of how we're going to plan to reduce or eliminate the restrictive practice. I think I mentioned that before. It doesn't have to be a complete elimination. It's not a failure if it's not. We just want to have a plan in place to make sure that we're using least restrictive practices at all time. So then we're moving into implementation and support. The BSP isn't just a document, it's something that needs to be actively used. So we train and coach support teams on the strategies included in the plan. These strategies were created alongside the care team to make sure that they're used consistently. So we work alongside providers, families, and carers to problem solve barriers and adjust strategies as needed. And that's again where that open communication comes in. We need to understand what strategies have been used first so that we don't, if there's something that really triggers and makes an individual flare up their behaviors of concern, maybe they don't like visuals, it's really triggering for them, we're not going to put visual supports in our plan. So we really need to understand what is and what's not working. You can include that in a separate part, but then we just need to be on top of it. We need to be making sure we're monitoring and seeing if things are working. They might turn around in 6 months and like visual supports. And so that's why we need to just be on top of it. And that's where our monitoring and review comes in. So PBS, as I said before, it is a continuous process. We don't just write the plan, hand it over and walk away and say, great, cool, enjoy, that's all yours now. Depending on the level of need, we may need to have care team meetings fortnightly or monthly with the key supports to gather insights on progress and offer support where needed. Plans need to be reviewed again every 6 to 12 months, depending on the type of plan. If you had an interim or an initial, be 6 months, comprehensive is 12. We collect data, measure progress, and make adjustments to ensure strategies are working and restrictive practices are being reduced or phased out where possible. So our key takeaways, I know I've just given you a lot of information. So looking at PBS, obviously PBS is a person-centered approach that promotes positive behaviour through understanding, support, and skill development. It involves a collaborative approach with an integrated support system of family, professionals, and support workers to implement effective strategies. PBS uses evidence-based planning with structured behaviour support plans based on assessment, monitoring, and continuous improvement. And the focus, again, is on human rights and dignity. We want to minimise restrictive practices through positive alternatives. That is all from me. I know I've just bombarded you with a lot of information. I hope you found that useful. I will open up the floor to any questions. Please don't hesitate to jump in and write your questions in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Ainsley. What a fantastic session. I'm just having a look at the chat and I can see some questions coming through. So I'll do my best to start answering, but I just want to caveat that with, as Ainsley mentioned, she's based in New South Wales. I'm based in Victoria. With restrictive practices, obviously there are a lot of state-based requirements and specifics. So we'll do our best to answer, but if we don't get to your question or we're not able to answer it, really confidently at this time, I'll take those questions away and we will get back to you via email. So, and obviously also feel free to email us with any additional questions that you might have after the session. So our first one is, what's the difference between a parent and informal carer? And look, I guess what I'd say about that is that a parent is, someone who's more of a biological, adoptive, or legal guardian, where there are legal rights and responsibilities. And an informal carer is someone who, I guess, provides ongoing unpaid support to a person with a disability, illness, mental health conditions, or age-related needs. The next one is, does the reporting within a family environment change with age? If it's an adult child, is it reportable? So there are, I guess what I'd say to this is that there are different regulations, I suppose, when it's a child, I believe under the age of 16. So the NDIS do have different guidelines for children. So it may be something that's actually deemed reasonable for a parent to be doing. So I guess maybe a clear example is maybe restrictions on screen time when it's a 10-year-old versus restrictions on screen time when it's a 20-year-old. So there, it'll be counted as a restrictive practice, I suppose, for the adult, but maybe not necessarily for the child, because that's a reasonable thing for a parent to implement. Same with, things like locking the door at night time, or, and so on. So there are different reporting requirements depending on the age of the participant. Is that anything you'd add to that, Ainsley, or did I cover that okay?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think I've had a few situations, like you said, with the electronics, it seems to be a really big thing. If it is sort of triggering behaviors, then yeah, of course, if they are older, then it would still be reportable. But yeah, just, I guess, using your own judgment on that.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. Now there's one here. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer it. Maybe that we need, to know the specifics and so on, but there's a question around, I'm interested in SIL homes for adults where they're doing restrictive practices without a BSP. For example, I've got one who's not allowing a participant to go to a friend's home until a safety assessment has been completed. But this has been 4 months and they want the OT to complete this, and the friend is not in a SIL home. Why would they even give consent? And I've just been made aware of this, but I think it is an unauthorized restrictive practice by a provider. Feel free to jump in, Ainsley. I think, yeah, it sounds like quite a specific situation. From the outset of that description, does seem like it probably needs some additional review there, because you're right, and this is where we're balancing things like dignity of risk versus duty of care, and how we're allowing participants, empowering participants to participate in the community. So I think it's right to potentially highlight that and question that, and probably something I would say is worth investigating further, but I won't go into specifics if I don't know the situation. And this is where restrictive practices get really hairy, and there's lots of different questions and conversations, but yes, does sound like something to look into further for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Jess, just to keep an eye on it. Yeah, just sort of lean on if there's any other, I'm not sure if there was mentioning if there's any other stakeholders that you can lean on and have discussions with about that, and just, see if there's something that can be done there. That is tricky.
Yeah. So the next one's how will, I guess, and it is a little funny how BSP is for both behaviour support practitioner and behaviour support plan, so the acronyms can get a bit confusing. But how will BSP meet the needs of person living with dementia in a SIL? So, I mean, like with any participant that we are supporting, we're going through that PBS process that Ainsley went through. We're doing assessments, we're consulting with the person as much as we possibly can, with the key stakeholders, and it depends. Sometimes we're supporting participants where there aren't even necessarily behaviours of concern. So something to really emphasise at the end of the day is that behaviour support, positive behaviour support, is about improving quality of life. So, depending on the situation, it may be sometimes when we're working with aged care participants, where, just seeing if there are restrictive practices in the environment and looking to support to reduce them, or we're just helping to improve quality of life. So it would be the same process essentially, and then individualizing that once we have all the information. All right. I might have to get to that one later. How do RPs change with young children? Oh, so I think we did cover that one just before. Do parent BSP still get put onto the portal, then closed off. Yeah, that's correct. So when it's a family implemented restrictive practice, essentially it just goes up, like the practitioner still needs to include that in the report, and then it basically gets put into PRODA, but it just gets closed off. So I think what I've sort of gathered from that is really the NDIS just wanting to note, they do quite extensive reporting on how many RPs are being implemented across Australia, comparing them year to year, whether they've increased, decreased, and so on. But like Ainsley mentioned, parents are not they're not governed by the NDIS. They're not an implementing provider. So while it's just reported in the plan, more really for oversight purposes at this stage, it will get uploaded onto the portal and then closed off. That's correct. Can a BSP be an allied health practitioner in private practice? What happens if the practice is not a registered NDIS provider? That's an interesting question. So a behaviour support practitioner in and of itself, in order to become a behaviour support practitioner, you actually have to be deemed suitable by the NDIS. And so there's quite a process there even to become a BSP. So I guess what I'm saying is you couldn't be a behaviour support practitioner and not be like registered by the NDIS if you're doing it correctly. While I understand that, there are probably allied health providers or even schools sometimes who are doing their own version of behaviour support, to be a positive behaviour support practitioner, to practice under, the Improved Relationships, funding with the NDIS, you would have to be under a registered NDIS provider company and registered as a behaviour support practitioner. I hope that made sense. How would we determine whether it's a parenting skill or an RP?
I guess in that sense, it would just be about understanding and educating yourself on what the I guess skill is that is being used. So asking questions, just asking a lot of questions if it is a parent or an informal carer, just understanding why it's being used. It's very hard to say. Like we mentioned before, if it is just a standard thing with electronics, say, and electronics go away every night at 5 p.m. and that's it, they're not accessing them just because that's what they want to reduce the use of screens, then obviously that would be a parenting skill. But if they're taking away the electronic because it's causing an increase in behaviours of concern or it is related to a child's behaviour, then that would be classified as an RP. It's the same, I guess, with, what's another example, Jess? I guess like the timeout or something. It's very hard, if you're doing a timeout and saying, okay, well, you've done the wrong thing. If you're going to go sit over there for 10 minutes and then we'll come back and chat about it. That might be a little bit different to, locking them in their room or telling them they can't move from a certain spot, even if they need to go to the toilet because they've done the wrong thing or, that sort of thing. So just really understanding.
Yeah, a good rule of thumb or way I think of it is, are you sort of implementing this due to behaviour? Is it directly linked to a behaviour? Even as behaviour support practitioners, sometimes we need to take a step back and go, is this practice being implemented because of behaviour or is it for another reason? So if it's directly linked, then you can start to unpack a little bit more whether something is an RP or not.
Yeah.
All right. I have a participant that is under the care of the minister with a support provider contracted by the state, not NDIS. They are not required to report on when they use the restrictive practice. Is that right? Also, could you please elaborate the process and role of the BSP in this scenario? So sounds like a question around supporting a participant so I guess, yes, places like schools, for example, hospitals are not required to report to the NDIS. I don't know if that's what you're referring to specifically, but there are, institutions that are not NDIS regulated. They're obviously not regulated by the NDIS, prisons and things as well. If that is what you're talking about, the role of the behaviour support practitioner essentially doesn't change. So again, you still go through the whole process and report it in the behaviour support plan, but there's ways that we'll basically put in the plan that it's not an NDIS registered provider. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ainsley, if that's my understanding. It still gets uploaded to PROTA, but that institution, of course, not governed by the NDIS, is not required to report through PROTA. Yeah, hopefully that answered your question. Is there a specific levelling of RPs, low level, seclusion, high level? So there are tiers. So I believe in South Australia, they have very clear guidelines on the different tiers of restrictive practices. I think it does differ slightly in each state. But yes, so for example, God, if anyone's in South Australia, I'm getting this wrong, we will make amendments later. But my understanding is that, environmental and chemical are sort of level 1, tier 1 restraints. And then tier 2 are things like chemical, mechanical, seclusion. And then combinations of these sometimes as well warrant higher tier levels. So if you've got multiple, that's something to consider as well. So there are different levels and in different states. So for example, in Victoria, the Victorian senior practitioner would have to approve the, mechanical, physical and seclusion restraints on a BSP, but not necessarily chemical or environmental every time. So there are different levels. And with physical as well, I know that in Victoria, I believe it's everywhere, but there are certain physical restraints that are just completely banned. Essentially, they're completely discouraged, and as Ainsley mentioned, may need to be ceased immediately. And there are resources on the NDIS website about certain physical restraints that aren't allowed to be done by any provider. Around chemical restraints, when we open the discussion around our responsibilities, what is considered as a CR and are responded to with, but you're not a doctor, and are hesitant to share this information? How do we navigate this?
So I guess when I'm looking at that, I guess it just depends on who we're talking to. If it's a parent or a stakeholder, like I said in the presentation, just having that open discussion and engaging with everyone. So, asking for the GP contact and then just reaching directly out to the GP and having a purpose of medication and just understanding why this is being administered. It is just, I guess, about backing your education and your understanding of chemical restraints. And no, we're not a doctor, but we're working with doctors to understand how it impacts behaviours, and that's what we are experts in. So just back yourself, work with GPs and work and speak to them, have open dialogue and have that information there to, so that you understand and you can educate, and just take it as a teaching moment.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, but not going to lie, it is really tricky sometimes being able to navigate these sorts of conversations with medical practitioners and prescribing practitioners. So yes, fully acknowledging, obviously we're not a doctor, and we'll stay in our lane, but this is sort of what we're required to do. Is there a way we can collaborate? Keep it really collaborative, keep it open. But yeah, it can be really tricky as well. All right. If there are any there, Ainsley, because we probably only have time for a couple more.
Mm-hmm. Let me have a little look.
What are the monitoring and recording systems required by a registered NDIS provider with restrictive practices?
So is that
So
recording and not reporting is PRODA?
yeah.
But monitoring and recording is that individual?
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what you're referring to specifically. Monitoring recording system required by an NDIS provider. Yeah, so I would say PRODA is probably what we're talking about here. Sorry, my mind quickly went to data monitoring and
Yeah,
collection as well. So as behaviour support practitioners, we do have our own, each provider probably has their own way of doing it. We have at Insight our own forms that we would share with providers to be able to gather that data for us. However, if you are a provider, I think it may be dependent on the state that you're in as well. There's a RID system, there's PRODA, there's different things depending on the state. So I'd certainly check out the NDIS website there to see what your particular obligations are in your state. If there are questions we haven't got to, because I can see that it looks like not everyone can see everyone else's questions. I'll filter through the chat and we will try to answer any that we haven't got to as best we can.
There's a couple to see. Yeah, there's a few there that.
Yeah, is authorization done on a service basis or should it be applied for an individual basis? Authorization of an RP would be based on the plan for the individual. So if that's, I don't know if I'm understanding the question exactly, but authorization would be for a particular plan, not necessarily an RP for that entire service. So if a restricted practice is approved, it doesn't mean that you can then use it with, everyone in that SIL, for example. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, there's just two I can see here on vehicle RP. So harnesses, and so are harnesses behavioural postural for vehicles seen as RP or safety devices, seen as RPs or safety devices, and then also are vehicle seatbelt buckle covers considered an RP. So if they are limiting the movement and the autonomy of the individual based on behaviours, and yes, if it is a safety issue like with wheelchairs, or if they're based on their diagnosis, then it would just be therapeutic. So just if it is behavioural, again, like Jess said, if you're coming back to it and you're saying, okay, they're trying to take their seatbelt off and remove around the car or the van, then yes, it is.
And there's also additional things with that too, in that if the vehicle is in motion, I believe that a buckle cover is not considered an RP. However, you must, and this comes into, least amount of time possible, shortest amount of time possible, least restrictive, is that as soon as the car stops moving, you would stop. You would take the buckle cover off. So if it's because that's complying with the law to have your seatbelt on, it's not considered an RP, but you wouldn't want to, leave the person in the car for any longer than they need to be with the buckle cover or harness on.
Yeah. Need to be
all right.
Yeah.
Now I'm conscious of time, and there are plenty of questions, as I suspected there would be for the RP session. Look, we will absolutely do our best to go through these questions, and we'll send out some more information on that. And if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to email us. I'm just going to pop this feedback QR code on the screen now. So I think I'm still sharing. Yes. So if you've got that, you can pop your phone up to that and get to our feedback form. We would love your feedback, positive or constructive. And if you do have any questions, let us know. We'll send out the recording to you in the next day or so. But again, wanted to thank you all so much for attending our Positive Pathway series. A huge thank you to you, Ainsley, for a fantastic presentation. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
everyone.